They built a whole damn ranch on my land like I wouldn't notice, like I wouldn't fight back. I remember standing there that morning, sun just rising, staring at a brand new wooden fence that stretched across my property line like it belonged. And behind it, a stable, a feed shed, even a smug little HOA sign declaring it part of their community expansion. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I walked back to my truck, opened my glove box, and pulled out the land deed, my name, my signature, my right. That's when I knew what had to be done. I didn't ask questions. I didn't wait for permission. I tore down every inch of that fence with my own 2 hands. Then I brought in my livestock and set up camp right where their fantasy ended, on land they thought they stole. What happened next? That's where the real story begins. Before the fences, before the shouting, before the legal threats and board meetings, I remember the silence. The kind of silence only wide open land can give you. Mornings out here were sacred. I'd sit on the porch with a chipped mug of coffee, watching the fog lift off the grass like it had a story to tell. This land wasn't just a piece of property with coordinates and survey lines. It was my family's soul stitched into soil. My father spent 40 years dreaming of owning land that no one could take from us, and when he finally did, he made sure the deed had my name on it too. Every tree out here has his fingerprints. Every rock reminds me of a story he told me when I was a boy. My mother planted wildflowers near the old fence line just because she said the earth needed something pretty. After they passed, this land became all I had left of them. I took care of it like you'd care for an old photograph, gentle, grateful, sacred. I knew every sound, every smell, every stretch of sunlight that kissed that field in the afternoon. There was never any noise, never any trouble, just peace. The kind of peace you don't talk about because it feels too rare to be real. I'd never locked a gate. I never had to. No one ever crossed our boundary because around here, respect ran deeper than fences. So when the trouble came, when the silence was shattered and strangers treated my home like a blank canvas for their HOA project, it wasn't just a violation of land. It was a violation of memory, of legacy, of everything my family had poured into this place. That's when the storm began, and I knew peace wouldn't return until I fought for it. It started with the sound of hammers, dull thuds echoing across the morning calm like warning shots. At first, I thought maybe a neighbor was fixing up a shed or putting in a new post box. But when I stepped out to see what was going on, my stomach dropped. There were 6 construction workers on my land, driving stakes into the dirt like they owned the place. Long wooden beams lay stacked neatly in the grass, heavy-duty fencing rolled out in rows, and spray-painted lines scarred the earth I'd walked 1,000 times barefoot. I marched down the hill, heart pounding, demanding to know what they were doing. One of them shrugged and said they were putting in a new HOA equestrian trail and ranch paddock. On whose land? I asked. He pointed vaguely back toward the HOA clubhouse and said, Karen gave us the go-ahead. That's when I saw her. HOA President Karen herself, standing under a canopy sipping iced tea like this was her backyard. She didn't even flinch when she saw me. In fact, she smiled. Told me I must have missed the community email about land usage reassignment and that, technically, the boundary lines were open to interpretation based on the HOA's new map. I told her this wasn't a grey area, this was my property, legally deeded and registered. Her smile didn't fade. She said, well, if there's a disagreement, we can resolve it through the HOA's legal counsel. But in the meantime, construction continues. Just like that. No apology. No delay. They acted like they had the right, like I didn't exist. Over the next few days, they built without pause. Fencing, signage, even a small shed labeled community livestock storage. I stood at my window every night watching strangers carve up my land, my family's legacy, while Karen waved to passing cars and called it progress. No permit. No survey. No soul. Just entitlement wrapped in HOA bylaws. That was the moment I realized they weren't just crossing a boundary, they were declaring war. And I wasn't about to lose a single inch without a fight. I tried reasoning with them at first, thinking maybe, just maybe, this was all some massive mistake. I brought copies of the deed, the survey maps, even old photos of my dad and me putting in the original fence posts to prove the land was ours. I walked right into that HOA board meeting, heart pounding, hands shaking, hoping logic would win over arrogance. But they didn't even let me finish. Karen cut me off with that smug little smirk, waved my paperwork away, and said, "You're welcome to file a complaint with the compliance committee, but construction is already underway." The rest of the board sat there nodding, pretending to be neutral, when their boots were already knee-deep in my soil. They told me I was being hostile, disruptive, and that I had 48 hours to vacate the disputed zone or face daily fines and possible legal action for trespassing. Trespassing. On my own land. The audacity didn't just sting, it burned. I walked out of that meeting shaking with fury, but something inside me clicked. I wasn't going to beg for my own birthright. I wasn't going to shrink. So, the next morning, I showed up at the fence line with my truck, a crowbar, and every document I needed to prove ownership. I didn't shout. I didn't threaten. I just started pulling the boards down, one by one. The workers stood there frozen, unsure of what to do until Karen came barreling down the hill, screaming that I was committing property damage and that she was calling the sheriff. I looked her square in the face and said, "Please do. I'd love to explain to them how your ranch is built on my deeded land." That shut her up, at least for a moment. But the HOA doubled down. Within 24 hours, I got slapped with an official violation notice and a cease and desist order claiming I was threatening community peace and sabotaging an HOA project. They went door to door in the neighborhood, spinning their side of the story, painting me as unstable, uncooperative, even dangerous. Suddenly, neighbors who used to wave now averted their eyes. Some even sided with Karen, thinking I was the problem. I could feel the isolation setting in. But I wasn't alone. I had the truth, the law, and my family's legacy on my side. So I started documenting everything. Photos, videos, timestamps, GPS coordinates, proof they couldn't erase. I called a real land attorney, one who didn't play games with HOA intimidation. And while Karen was busy hosting meetings and rehearsing her next lie, I was preparing for war, not with fists, but with facts. The moment they threatened me for stepping foot on my own land was the moment they made this personal. And I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. ChatGPT said. The first thing I did. I stopped playing nice. I rented a livestock trailer, backed it right up to the edge of the land they claimed as their equestrian zone, and unloaded 5 goats and 3 chickens just as the sun came up. I wasn't subtle about it. I wanted them to see. Karen stood frozen at the end of the gravel path, phone in hand, probably texting the board in a panic. I didn't care. I had the deed in my glove compartment and a certified land surveyor's report showing the exact coordinates that proved the truth. Everything they built sat squarely on my property. Every fence post, every hay bale, every plank of their so-called community ranch was an illegal structure. And now, it was my livestock's new home. But I wasn't done. I called the county assessor's office, submitted my survey report, and filed a formal zoning complaint. I hired a drone operator to map the entire perimeter and capture aerial footage of the land in dispute. I even had my attorney draft a cease and desist letter, not for me, but for them. Within days, that letter hit the HOA's mailbox, informing them they were not only trespassing but potentially liable for thousands in property damage and unlawful occupation. The tide was turning, and fast. Karen tried to push back, of course. She called an emergency HOA meeting and invited a local news crew, hoping to paint me as a rogue neighbor disrupting community development. But the camera caught something better. It caught me calmly walking up, holding my deed, and pointing to the survey markers they'd bulldozed during construction. I asked the reporter one question: would you want someone building on your parents' land without asking? The clip went viral in the neighborhood Facebook group. Suddenly, neighbors who'd kept their distance began to speak up. Some of them had their own stories: Karen overstepping, abusing power, rewriting rules to suit herself. Then came the notice from the county inspector. The HOA had no permits for livestock operations, no authorization for fencing on that portion of land, and no legal right to any part of my acreage. They were ordered to cease all use of the area immediately and remove any remaining materials. When I saw that letter, I didn't celebrate, I just smiled and got back to work. The next morning, I brought in more livestock. A pair of ponies and a crate of feed. I rebuilt the fencing, this time stronger, taller, painted bright red to send a message: this land is taken. Karen drove by that afternoon and didn't even stop. She just stared through her tinted SUV window, jaw clenched, powerless for the first time. They thought they could erase me with paperwork and politics. But I came back with proof, patience, and a plan. I didn't just reclaim my land, I turned their so-called ranch into a monument of their failure. And for the first time in weeks, I breathed freely again. Because justice doesn't always come from courtrooms. Sometimes, it comes with hooves, feathers, and the quiet satisfaction of standing your ground. The fallout came faster than I expected, almost like once the truth cracked through their polished facade, the whole damn HOA structure started crumbling under its own weight. It started with a knock on Karen's door, this time not from a neighbor with a complaint or a board member with a clipboard, but from a county enforcement officer. The citations were clear and brutal: unpermitted construction, illegal fencing, unauthorized livestock infrastructure, and trespassing on private property. She tried to argue, tried to show her fancy little HOA maps, but the officer just pointed to the official county records and the certified survey I had submitted. My name was on the deed. The coordinates didn't lie. They had built their dream on someone else's reality, and now it was collapsing. The HOA board scrambled to save face. Emergency meetings were held in tight, panicked whispers. Karen tried to claim it was all a misunderstanding, that they had interpreted the land boundaries differently. But interpretation doesn't hold up in front of county law. Within a week, a removal order was issued, demanding that all fencing, structures, signage, and materials be cleared from my property line within 14 days. Or face fines starting at $5,000 per day. That was the moment Karen stopped smiling. The so-called community ranch project that she had paraded around as her legacy, her pride and joy, was now the center of public embarrassment. Word spread fast. Neighbors who had once applauded her leadership now whispered about how she nearly cost the HOA a lawsuit. A few even came by to apologize, quietly admitting they were misled, scared into silence by Karen's intimidation tactics. Some confided that she'd threatened them too, with fines, compliance letters, or property violations if they didn't fall in line. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about power, and how she'd abused it for far too long. Then came the biggest blow. My attorney filed a civil claim for property damage, emotional distress, and loss of use. The HOA's insurance provider got involved and launched their own internal investigation. And that's when the floodgates opened. Emails, internal memos, and meeting recordings were exposed. Documents showing that Karen had knowingly pushed the project forward despite being warned about the boundary dispute by a junior board member. She ignored it, buried it, lied about it. And now, the liability wasn't just on the HOA, it was squarely on her shoulders. Karen stepped down 2 weeks later. No speech. No farewell. Just a terse email resigning from the board, citing personal reasons. But the damage was already done. The HOA began restructuring, the ranch project was officially dissolved, and several board members faced penalties for participating in unauthorized development. As for me, I rebuilt. I planted fresh grass where their fence posts once stood, expanded my livestock pasture, and installed new signage at the edge of my land, big, bold, and crystal clear: private property, no HOA access. Justice didn't come in a courtroom. It came in the silence that followed their defeat, the kind of silence I hadn't heard since before the storm. Peace had returned, but this time, it was guarded by truth. And that was more powerful than any fence they'd ever build. When I walk my land now, there's a different kind of quiet in the air, one that doesn't ache with anger or confusion anymore. It's the quiet of peace reclaimed, of a fight won not just for property, but for principle. This land, it isn't just earth and trees. It's the beating heart of my family's story. Every breeze carries my father's laughter, every bloom whispers my mother's love. They didn't leave me money, or titles, or power. They left me this, something solid, something sacred, something that mattered. And for a while, I was afraid I'd lose it to people who thought paper rules were more powerful than blood, more binding than truth. But I stood up. I fought back. And in doing so, I found something I didn't know I'd been missing: my voice. This wasn't just about fences or bylaws or goats in a pasture. It was about refusing to let someone rewrite my story because it didn't fit their agenda. It was about drawing a line, not just in the soil, but in my soul, and saying, no more. I didn't want a war, but I wasn't afraid to fight one. And in that fight, I discovered that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it's steady. Sometimes, it's quiet. But it holds. So, to anyone who's ever been bullied, backed into a corner, or made to feel small on the land that made them whole, stand your ground. You don't need a title to defend your truth. Just a spine. And a reason worth standing for. If this story moved you, if you've ever stood up against injustice or dreamed of reclaiming what's rightfully yours, don't just scroll past. Like this video, subscribe for more real stories that hit where it hurts and heal where it matters, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded, you can fight back and win.